The air in the botanical garden was thick with the scent of overbred lilies and expensive perfume. It was a humid Tuesday, 3 days before the wedding, and we were gathered for the final walkthrough. My son, Marcel, looked handsome, his shoulders back, his smile bright, but I noticed the way his eyes kept darting toward his fiancée, Elena, and then toward the far end of the terrace where her parents stood, Genevieve and Alastair Brandon. They looked like they had been carved out of ice and dressed in linen. They stood apart from the greenery, as if the very grass of Georgia wasn't quite high-end enough for their designer loafers. I've lived 72 years on this earth. I've seen storms that could uproot oaks and quiet mornings that felt like a prayer. I know how to read a room, and more importantly, I know how to read the silence between people. As I walked across the stone path to join them, I felt the familiar weight of my gold locket against my chest. It was a gift from my late husband, a man who worked 40 years in the belly of a steel mill, so our son could go to the schools that eventually led him to a woman like Elena. I wasn't coming to them as a beggar. I was coming as the mother of the groom. Genevieve, Alastair, I said, my voice as steady as the tide. It's a beautiful afternoon for a rehearsal. I extended my hand. It's a simple gesture, a bridge, a recognition of shared future. Alastair didn't move. He didn't even look at my hand. He looked through me, his eyes settling somewhere on the horizon. Beside him, Genevieve pulled her silk shawl tighter around her shoulders, a small, tight smile flickering on her lips, the kind of smile you give a child who has asked an embarrassing question. We find, Alastair said, his voice clipped and polished to a sharp edge, that physical contact is best reserved for those within our immediate circle. We don't shake hands with low-level people. It's a matter of hygiene, mostly, social and otherwise. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy. It was the sound of a door locking. Behind them, I saw Marcel stiffen, his face flushing a deep, pained red. He heard it. He knew exactly what they had just called his mother, the woman who had scrubbed floors to pay for his bar exam prep. Elena looked away, suddenly very interested in the arrangement of the catering menus. I didn't pull my hand back immediately. I let it hang there in the air between us. A brown, wrinkled hand that had raised a scholar, a hand that knew the texture of hard work and the smoothness of grace. I looked at Alastair, not with anger, but with a quiet, clinical curiosity. It's a mistake to think that because someone is old, they are slow. And it's a fatal mistake to think that because someone is quiet, they are powerless. I see, I replied. I finally lowered my hand, smoothing the fabric of my skirt. Precision is important, Alastair, knowing exactly where everyone stands. It saves so much time in the long run. Genevieve let out a soft, airy laugh. I'm glad you understand, Victoria. It's nothing personal. It's just that some traditions are built on boundaries. It keeps the foundation pure. I nodded slowly, my mind already beginning to sift through the files of my memory, connecting the name Brandon to the old ledgers I still kept from my years as a head clerk for the city's most prestigious and private accounting firm. People forget that the person who handles the books sees the soul of a family. The foundation, I whispered more to myself than to them. Yes, we wouldn't want anything shifting beneath our feet, would we? As they turned away to discuss the placement of the champagne tower, Marcel hurried over, his voice a frantic whisper of apologies. I put a hand on his arm to steady him. I told him it was fine. I told him to focus on his bride. But as I watched the Brandons walk toward the valet, I wasn't thinking about the wedding cake or the flowers. I was thinking about the fact that Alastair Brandon had forgotten that even the tallest towers are built on dirt. If you think this is a story about a woman getting her feelings hurt at a garden party, you haven't been paying attention. The real guest list hasn't even been written yet. The drive home was quiet. Marcel offered to take me, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned a ghostly gray. But I declined. I needed the solitude of my own Buick. I needed the hum of the tires against the pavement to drown out the echoes of Alistair's voice. Low-level people. It's a curious phrase. It suggests a basement, a foundation, or perhaps something buried so deep it's forgotten until the ground starts to sink. When I reached my small brick cottage on the edge of the historic district, I didn't head for the kitchen to make tea. I went straight to the basement. People think senior women spend their golden years knitting scarves and watching game shows. Some do, but I spent 34 years as the senior archivist and head clerk for Randall, Brandon and Associates. Yes, that Brandon, Alistair's father, a man with much more iron in his blood than his son, had founded the firm. When I retired 10 years ago, they gave me a gold watch and a pension. What they didn't realize was that I had spent 3 decades digitizing records that were never meant to leave the vault. I sat at my desk, the glow of the computer monitor reflecting in my glasses. My fingers moved across the keys with a muscle memory that age hadn't touched. I wasn't looking for a scandal. Not yet. I was looking for the structure. The Brandons lived on old money, or so the town believed. They moved through charity galas and country clubs like they owned the air they breathed. But money is like water. It leaves a trail. It stains. It evaporates if the heat gets too high. I pulled up the 2014 audit trails. I remembered a discrepancy back then, a series of consulting fees paid out to a shell corporation called Linden Holdings. At the time, I was told it was a private matter for the board. I was told to reconcile and move on. As a black woman in a white shoe firm in the 90s and early 2000s, move on was a survival tactic, but I never truly let go of a thread once I felt the fray. As I scrolled, a pattern emerged. Linden Holdings wasn't a vendor. It was a vacuum. It was sucking the equity out of the Brandon family trust to cover something. Alistair had been the managing partner during those years. He wasn't just wealthy. He was a curator of a very expensive, very fragile illusion. I leaned back, the leather of my chair creaking. I thought about the way Genevieve had pulled her shawl tight, as if she were cold in the Georgia sun. She wasn't cold. She was guarded. She was protecting the only thing they had left, their status. To them, my son was a brilliant young lawyer who could provide a fresh infusion of prestige, and perhaps, eventually, a fresh infusion of capital to a name that was quietly rotting from the inside. They didn't see me as a mother-in-law. They saw me as a liability, a reminder of a world they thought they had ascended from. They didn't realize that I was the one who knew exactly how many bricks in their pure foundation were actually hollow. I picked up my phone and made a single call, not to a lawyer, not to a journalist. I called an old friend who still worked the night shift at the county records office. "Ruby," I said softly when she picked up. "It's Victoria. I need you to look up a deed for me. A property in the lowlands registered under a company called Linden. Take your time. I'm not in a hurry." I hung up and looked at the framed photo of Marcel on my desk. He looked so proud in his graduation robes. He deserved a life built on truth, not a marriage that was actually a merger for a bankrupt dynasty. The Brandons think they are safe because they won't touch me. They think distance is a shield. They don't understand that the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one making a scene. It's the one who is quietly checking the math. Ruby called me back at 4 a.m. That's the hour when the world is stripped of its pretenses. No birds singing, no traffic humming, just the cold, hard truth of the clock ticking. She didn't say hello. She just read off a series of coordinates and a tax ID number that made my stomach do a slow practice turn. "Victoria," she whispered, her voice gravelly from years of cigarettes and government coffee. "That property in the lowlands? It's a ghost. The deed was transferred 3 times in 48 hours back in 2014. It's sitting in a trust now. But here's the kicker. The primary beneficiary isn't Alistair. It's a holding company out of Delaware. And that holding company, it's currently being sued for environmental negligence in 3 different states. I thanked her and hung up. I sat in the dark for a long time, watching the first light of dawn bleed through the slats of my blinds. The Brandons weren't just broke, they were radioactive. They had been dumping toxic assets, literally and figuratively, into a shell game for a decade. The lifestyle they flaunted, the silk shawls and the disdain for low-level hands was a coat of gold paint over a rusted hull. They needed this wedding. They needed Marcel's clean reputation and his rising star in the district attorney's office to provide a shield of respectability. They weren't looking for a daughter-in-law. They were looking for a host. At 9 a.m., the doorbell rang. It was Elena. She looked exhausted, her pale skin translucent under the porch light. She held a box of expensive macaroons, a peace offering that felt as hollow as her father's promises. Victoria, she said, her voice trembling. I wanted to apologize for yesterday. My father, he's very traditional. He didn't mean it the way it sounded. I opened the screen door and stepped back, gesturing for her to enter. I didn't take the cookies. I led her to the kitchen table, where I had laid out a single piece of paper. A printed map of the Lowlands property Ruby had found. Tradition is a powerful word. Elena, I said, my tone is soft as a lullaby. It's often used to dress up things that are much uglier. Tell me, does Marcel know about Linden Holdings? Does he know that his future father-in-law is currently 1 court date away from a federal indictment? The color drained from her face so fast, I thought she might faint. She didn't look surprised. She looked caught. She sat down, her hands fluttering to her throat, touching a pearl necklace that I now realized was likely a borrowed heirloom from a dying estate. We were going to tell him, she whispered, after the honeymoon, once the merger went through. My father just needs a little more time to stabilize things. Stabilize, I repeated. It's a funny word. It's what you do to a building before it collapses. Elena, my son spent his childhood watching me count every penny so he could have a life of integrity. He believes in the law. He believes in the truth. You aren't asking him to join a family. You're asking him to join a conspiracy. She looked up at me, her eyes brimming with tears. I love him, Victoria. I really do. This has nothing to do with the money. Everything has to do with the money when you don't have any left. I replied. I leaned in closer, my shadow stretching long across the table. I'm going to give you a choice because I believe in the agency of young women. You can tell him the truth today, or you can wait until Friday and let the truth find him in front of 300 guests. Either way, the Brandon name is going to be spoken in a very different tone by Monday morning. She stared at the map on the table. She saw the lines, the boundaries, the traps. She saw that I wasn't an angry mother-in-law. I was the architect of her reality. You'd destroy us, she breathed. You'd ruin the wedding. For what? Because he wouldn't shake your hand. I stood up and walked to the sink, beginning to wash a single teacup. No, Elena. Not because he wouldn't shake my hand. Because he thought I was too low to see what he was doing in the dirt. He underestimated the view from the ground. She left without her macaroons. I watched her car pull away, knowing she wouldn't tell him. Fear makes people cowards before it makes them honest. But that was fine. I've always preferred a live audience for a final act. By Wednesday, the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. The Brandons had moved into the penthouse of the St. Regis, a fortress of glass and gold that overlooked the city they thought they still owned. They hadn't called. Elena hadn't told Marcel. I knew this because my son stopped by that evening, his eyes bright with a frantic kind of joy that only a man who is being lied to can carry. "The Brandons are handled, Ma," he said, leaning against my kitchen counter. Alistair apologized. Well, he sent a bottle of scotch and a note. He said he was under immense professional pressure and didn't mean to be curt. "We're moving forward. No more drama, okay?" I looked at my son. He has my nose and his father's stubborn chin. He wanted this to be a fairy tale. He wanted to believe that the world was as polished as the marble in his new office. I didn't tell him that a bottle of scotch is just a liquid bribe for a guilty conscience. I just patted his cheek. "Of course, Marcel. No more drama. I've already started finalizing my own preparations." He smiled, relieved, and left to go to a bachelor dinner. As soon as his car cleared the driveway, I went back to my laptop. Revenge, when done properly, isn't about a single blow. It's about an accumulation of weight. It's about making the target realize that the ground they're standing on has been replaced by a trapdoor, and they were the ones who built the mechanism. I didn't need to leak the Linden Holdings documents to the press. That's messy. That's loud. Instead, I sent out 4 invitations. They weren't wedding invitations. The Brandons had already handled the official guest list, carefully vetting everyone to ensure no low-level elements remained. No, these were private invitations to a pre-wedding investment briefing held in a private suite at the very same hotel where the rehearsal dinner was taking place. The recipients, 4 men, creditors, men Alistair had been dodging for 18 months. Men who represented the old money, the kind that doesn't need to boast because it simply exists, silent and predatory. They were the ones Alistair owed for the stabilization Elena had mentioned. I attached a single PDF to each digital invitation, the actual valuation of the Brandon Family Trust, stripped of the creative accounting I had helped hide a decade ago. I showed them where the money had gone. I showed them that the merger with my son's future wasn't an investment. It was a bankruptcy protection scheme. I sat back and watched the read receipts flicker to life one by one. In the world of the elite, the only thing more offensive than being poor is being a fraud. Alistair hadn't just insulted my heritage. He had insulted their intelligence. He had invited these lions to a feast, only for them to realize they were the ones on the menu. The phone rang. It was an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. "Victoria, it's Alistair." His voice was no longer clipped and polished. It was serrated. "I don't know what you think you're doing. I don't know who you've been talking to, but I suggest you stop. For Marcel's sake. You wouldn't want to ruin his big day over a misunderstanding." I didn't call him back. I didn't need to. He was already breathing the air of a sinking ship. He thought he was threatening me. He didn't realize that when you've spent your life being looked over, you learn how to move in the shadows without making a sound. The wedding was 48 hours away. The flowers were being chilled. The champagne was on ice. And the men who owned Alistair Brandon's soul were currently boarding private jets to attend a meeting he didn't know he had scheduled. As I tucked myself into bed, I felt a strange sense of peace. My house was quiet. My conscience was clear. I wasn't the one who had lied. I was simply the one who was making sure the truth arrived on time. If you're wondering why I haven't told Marcel yet, it's because a mother knows when her child needs to see the fire for himself to understand that the stove is hot. Thursday morning arrived with a thin veil of fog that clung to the Georgia pines. It was the kind of morning that hides the horizon, making the world feel small and private. I spent it in my garden pruning the hydrangeas. There is a specific rhythm to gardening: clip, clear, move on. It requires patience and a sharp edge. By noon, the fog had lifted, but the air remained heavy. My phone buzzed on the stone bench beside me. It was a text from an unlisted number. "The documents are verified. We'll be in the lobby at 7. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The men I had contacted, the ones Alistair had been borrowing from to maintain his facade, weren't the type to settle for a phone call. They were the type to show up in person to inspect their collateral. And currently, Alistair's collateral was the Brandon name, which was about to be legally tethered to my son's reputation. At 1 o'clock, Marcel called. His voice sounded thin, like wire pulled too tight. "Ma, something's going on at the St. Regis," he said. "Elena's been in her room all morning. Alistair is pacing the lobby like a caged tiger. He's snapped at 3 servers already." I tried to talk to him about the prenuptial adjustments he mentioned, and he looked at me like I was a stranger, like he didn't even know who I was. I set my shears down. Stress does strange things to a man's memory. Marcel, especially a man who has a lot to remember. "He's acting like he's afraid of something," Marcel continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Ma, did you say something to Elena? She won't look me in the eye." I told her the truth. "Son, what she does with it is her burden, not mine. Are you coming by for dinner?" "I can't. There's a mandatory family meeting at the hotel. Alistair says it's about legacy alignment. Sounds like corporate nonsense, but he insisted. Legacy alignment." I almost laughed. It was a beautiful euphemism for a shakedown. Alistair was trying to consolidate his lies before the creditors arrived. He wanted to make sure Elena and Marcel were on board with whatever story he had to tell to keep the wolves from the door. "Go to your meeting, Marcel," I said gently, "but keep your ears open. Listen to what isn't being said. And remember what I told you when you passed the bar. A contract is only as strong as the people who sign it." After we hung up, I went inside and changed into my best silk suit, navy blue, understated, and timeless. I pinned a gold locket to my lapel. Inside that locket wasn't a photo of my husband. It was a micro SD card containing the original, unedited ledgers from Randall, Brandon and Associates, the ones that showed exactly how Alistair's father had siphoned the first few millions into the Linden accounts. Alistair thought he was the architect of this deception. He didn't realize he was just a second-generation tenant in a house of cards his father had started building 30 years ago. He thought he was protecting a legacy. I was the one who actually knew what that legacy was worth. I drove to the St. Regis, but I didn't go to the penthouse. I went to the bar in the lobby, a dim, mahogany-paneled room where the wealthy go to hide in plain sight. I ordered a mineral water with lime and sat in a corner booth that offered a clear view of the elevators. At 6:45 p.m., the glass doors slid open. 4 men walked in. They didn't look like villains. They looked like board members. They moved with the terrifying, quiet confidence of people who don't have to raise their voices to be heard. They didn't see me. I was just an elderly black woman sitting alone with a glass of water. To them, I was part of the furniture, a low-level fixture of the service industry. I watched them enter the elevator. I watched the floor indicator climb steadily toward the penthouse. Upstairs, my son was waiting. Upstairs, Alistair was preparing his speech about family and tradition. He had no idea that the hygiene he was so worried about was about to involve a very public scrubbing. The elevator stopped at the top floor. I took a slow sip of my water. The ice clinked against the glass, a small, sharp sound in the quiet room. The St. Regis lobby was a cathedral of consumerism, all vaulted ceilings and the muffled clink of crystal. From my corner booth, I watched the digital floor indicator above the elevator bank. 22, 24, 26, the penthouse. Up there, the air was likely thin with desperation. Alistair would be standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city as if he still held the keys to it. Marcel would be sitting on a leather sofa, confused by the sudden investment meeting his future father-in-law had insisted upon. And Elena Elena would be the most dangerous person in the room because she knew the truth and was still trying to decide which side of the sinking ship to jump from. I checked my watch. 7:12 p.m. The four men I had invited, the silent titans of the Georgia banking world, would be stepping into the foyer now. They didn't need to knock. They held the notes on the very furniture Alistair was leaning against. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Marcel. "Ma, some men just walked in. Alistair looks like he's seen a ghost. He told me and Elena to go into the library. Something is wrong." I leaned back, the cool condensation of my water glass dampening my palm. Something is wrong. No, Marcel. Something is finally right. The low-level truth was simply rising to meet the high-level lies. I spent 30 years in those offices. I knew how Alistair's father. And then Alistair viewed people like me. We were the ink in the pens. We were the electricity in the walls. Necessary, but invisible. They never thought the ink would start writing its own story. They never thought the walls were listening. I finished my water and stood up. I didn't head for the elevators. Not yet. I walked toward the hotel's business center, a quiet, wood-paneled room tucked behind the grand staircase. The young man at the desk looked up, offering a practiced, hollow smile. "Can I help you, ma'am?" "Yes," I said, my voice soft but resonant. "I'm Victoria Randall. I believe there's a package for me from the county records office." He checked his system, his brow furrowing. "Ah, yes. A courier dropped it off an hour ago. It's quite heavy." He handed me a thick, manila envelope. It was the physical manifestation of 40 years of secrets. In it were the original land surveys of the Lowlands property, the toxic dump that Alistair had used as collateral for his latest line of credit. But it also contained something else, the signed affidavits from the 3 former clerks I had kept in touch with, clerks who remembered Alistair's father adjusting the books, clerks who had been paid to stay silent until the statute of limitations ran out, or so the Brandons thought. But environmental fraud doesn't have a shelf life when the chemicals are still in the ground. I tucked the envelope under my arm. I felt a strange, cold clarity. I wasn't doing this for spite. Spite is a hot, messy emotion. I was doing this for balance. If the Brandons wanted a pure foundation, they were going to have to dig through the dirt to find it. I walked back to the elevators. This time, I pressed the button for the 26th floor. The doors opened to a hallway carpeted in a pattern so intricate it made my head spin. At the end of the hall, the double doors to the Brandon suite were cracked open. I could hear voices, not shouting, but the low, rhythmic rumble of men discussing a foreclosure. "The assets are diversified. Alistair," one of the men was saying, "but the debt isn't. You've leveraged your daughter's marriage against a property that is currently under federal investigation. That isn't business. That's a gamble. And you lost." I stood in the hallway, invisible in the shadows of the alcove. I saw Elena slip out of the library, her face a mask of terror. She saw me. She froze. I didn't say a word. I simply held up the manila envelope. She knew what was in it. She knew the game was over before the first "I do" could be whispered. The silence between us was a bridge that had finally collapsed. "You don't understand," she mouthed, her eyes wide. "I understand everything, Elena," I whispered back. "I'm an archivist. I keep things in their proper place." The suite was silent now, but it was the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. I stepped through the double doors, my heels clicking softly on the Italian marble. In the center of the room, Alistair stood flanked by the 4 men in charcoal suits. He looked smaller than he had at the garden. The frost in his eyes had melted into a watery, desperate sheen. Marcel was standing by the library door, his face a map of sudden, painful realization. He looked at me, then at the envelope under my arm, then back at Alistair. "My son is a lawyer. He knows when a case is closed before the judge even strikes the gavel. Mother! Marcel's voice was a ragged whisper. What are you doing here? I didn't answer him immediately. I looked at Alistair. I believe you mentioned something about hygiene, Alistair, about keeping the foundation pure. I thought I'd bring over some cleaning supplies. I walked to the mahogany table and laid the manila envelope down. I didn't throw it. I placed it with the precision of a surgeon. One of the creditors, a man named Brandon, no relation, though the irony wasn't lost on me, reached out and opened the flap. He pulled out the land surveys and the affidavits. The room grew colder. Alistair's breath hitched, a small, pathetic sound. These records were sealed. Alistair rasped, his voice failing him. They were destroyed years ago. Nothing is ever truly destroyed, Alistair, I said, my voice steady and low. It's just filed away by people you think are too low to matter. I didn't just work for your father. I watched him. I learned how he moved, and I learned where he hid the things he couldn't carry. Genevieve emerged from the bedroom, her silk robe fluttering like the wings of a trapped bird. She looked at the men, then at me. Who is this woman? Alistair, tell security to remove this person. Alistair didn't move. He couldn't. He was staring at the signature on the bottom of the lead affidavit. My own. She is the security, Genevieve, Alistair whispered. She's been the one holding the keys for 30 years. Marcel walked toward the table. He picked up one of the documents, his eyes scanning the legal descriptions of the toxic runoff in the lowlands. He looked at Elena, who was leaning against the wall, her face buried in her hands. You knew, Marcel said to her. It wasn't a question. Marcel, Elena started, but the words died in her throat. You were going to let me sign my name to this. Marcel's voice rose, not in a shout, but in a vibrating chord of betrayal. You were going to let me use my position at the DA's office to stabilize a criminal enterprise? You didn't want a husband. You wanted a janitor. I stayed quiet. This was the moment the mirror had to break. If I had told him a week ago, he would have defended her. He would have called me cynical. But seeing the paper trail, the cold, hard math of their deceit, that was a truth he couldn't negotiate with. One of the creditors looked up from the files. Mr. Brandon, the bridge loan is officially revoked. We will be filing for an immediate injunction on the family trust. I suggest you find a very good lawyer, though, given the contents of these affidavits, I doubt many will take the case. The men stood up in unison. They didn't look back as they walked out. They didn't need to. They had seen enough. I turned to my son. He looked like he had aged a decade in 10 minutes. Come on, Marcel. Let's go home. But the wedding, Genevieve wailed, her voice shrill and thin. The guests, the press, think of the scandal. I looked at her, really looked at her, for the last time. The scandal isn't the wedding being canceled. Genevieve, the scandal is that you thought you could build a throne out of other people's poison and never have to smell the fumes. As we walked toward the door, I felt Marcel's hand on my shoulder. It was heavy, but it was honest. If you think the story ends with a broken wedding and a ruined name, you're missing the point. The real work isn't in the tearing down. It's in what happens when the dust settles and you realize you're finally standing on level ground. Friday morning arrived not with the ringing of wedding bells, but with the persistent, rhythmic tolling of a telephone that no one wanted to answer. I sat in my kitchen, the sunlight hitting the linoleum in long, golden bars. I was peeling a peach, the skin coming away in one continuous, perfect spiral. Precision. It's a habit you don't lose, even when the world outside is screaming. Marcel was asleep in his old bedroom upstairs. He'd come home with me last night, silent as a shadow. He hadn't asked for explanations. He didn't need to. The documents had spoken a language he understood better than any mother's warning, the language of liability, fraud, and intent. The local news was already buzzing. A private family matter had led to the postponement of the Brandon Randall nuptials. That was the polite version. The street version, whispered in the corridors of the courthouse where Marcel worked, was much sharper. People were starting to notice the black town cars parked outside the Brandon estate, not wedding planners, but process servers. My phone chimed. A text from Ruby. The EPA just flagged the Linden coordinates. Federal oversight is moving in. Alastair's trying to liquidate the penthouse assets. Too late. The freeze hit at 8 a.m. I took a bite of the peach. It was sweet with just a hint of tartness. Alastair had spent his life thinking he was the one holding the leash. He thought that because I moved quietly, I was subservient. He thought that because I was low level, I didn't have the reach to touch his high-altitude world. He didn't realize that the higher you build, the more you depend on the stability of the ground. And I had been the one measuring the soil for 30 years. There's a specific kind of panic that sets in for people like the Brandons when they realize their name no longer functions as currency, when the maitre d' doesn't recognize them, when the dry cleaners ask for payment up front, when the immediate circle Genevieve was so proud of suddenly shrinks until there's no one left but the creditors. Around noon, a sleek black SUV pulled into my driveway. It wasn't the police. It was Elena. She didn't get out of the car for a long time. I watched her through the sheer curtains of my living room. She looked small behind the tinted glass. When she finally stepped out, she wasn't wearing the designer silk or the pearls. She was wearing a simple trench coat, her hair pulled back in a messy knot. She looked like a woman who had finally run out of places to hide. I opened the door before she could knock. "He's sleeping," I said, my voice a soft barrier. "I'm not here for Marcel," she whispered. Her eyes were red-rimmed, the skin beneath them bruised with exhaustion. "I'm here to ask, why? You could have stopped this months ago. You could have told him before the deposits were paid, before the dress was fitted. Why wait until we were standing in the wreckage?" I stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door shut behind me. I looked at the street, where the neighborhood kids were riding bikes, oblivious to the high-stakes theater unfolding in our lives. "Because, Elena," I said, turning my gaze back to her, "if I had told him months ago, you would have lied. You would have spun a web of family secrets and professional misunderstandings. He would have chosen his heart over his head. I had to wait until the weight of the truth was too heavy for even your father to lift. I had to make sure that when it fell, it stayed down." She leaned against the porch railing, her shoulders sagging. "They're going to take everything, aren't they?" "They're going to take what isn't theirs," I corrected. "There's a difference." "My father, he's talking about disappearing to the islands. He thinks he still has a private account." I smiled, a small, thin thing. "Tell him not to bother." The offshore routing for the Linden dividends went through the Randall branch office back in '08. I closed that loop yesterday afternoon. He's as grounded as a stone. She looked at me then, not with anger, but with a profound, chilling realization. She saw the architect. She saw that I hadn't just reacted to an insult. I had been holding the blueprint for their downfall since before she was born. "You really don't shake hands with people like us, do you?" she asked, her voice hollow. "I don't shake hands with ghosts," I replied. And that's all the Brandons are now, memories of a wealth that was never real. She turned and walked back to her car. She didn't look back. She knew the bridge wasn't just burned. It had been erased from the map. As her car disappeared around the corner, I felt a hand on my shoulder. Marcel was standing in the doorway, his eyes tired but clear. He had heard. "Ma," he said softly. How much of it was for me, and how much was for the low-level comment? I looked at my son, the only legacy that truly mattered. It was for the truth, Marcel. The insult just made sure I delivered it in person. Saturday was supposed to be the day of the grand reception. Instead, it was the day the social registry became a casualty list. I spent the morning in my kitchen, not with a cookbook, but with the local society pages spread out like a battle map. The St. Regis had officially canceled the booking. The florist had reclaimed the lilies. The caterer, a man I had known since Marcel was in diapers, called me to say the Brandons' credit card had been declined for the final balance. He sounded embarrassed, but I told him not to be. The bill always comes due, Henry, I said. Sometimes it just takes a few decades to process. By 2 p.m., the first cracks in the Brandons' inner circle began to gape open. These were the people Genevieve lived for. The judges, the old-line developers, the women who spent their afternoons debating the merits of various country clubs. They didn't care about the toxic dumping in the lowlands. They cared about the fact that Alistair was no longer a safe investment. I had sent one more anonymous tip, not to the police, but to the editor of the Chronicle's Gilded Age column. It wasn't about the fraud. It was about the exclusion. I included a copy of the seating chart Genevieve had labored over, the one where she had marked certain guests, including my own family, with a small red L for low. Seeing your name on a low-level list is a unique kind of fuel. By mid-afternoon, the very people the Brandons relied on for social protection were distancing themselves with surgical speed. I received a surprise visitor at 4 p.m. It was Alistair's younger sister, Beatrice. She was the black sheep of the family, mostly because she had married a schoolteacher and moved to a farmhouse in North Carolina. She was the only Brandon who had ever sent Marcel a birthday card that didn't have the family crest on it. Victoria, she said, standing on my porch with a weary smile. I heard the news. Or rather, I saw the blood in the water. I invited her in. We sat in the living room, the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock, the only sound between us. They're calling it a tragedy, Beatrice said, gesturing toward the city. But we both know it's an eviction. Alistair was always a landlord who forgot he didn't own the land. He forgot that the people who maintain the property are the ones who know where the leaks are. I replied. Beatrice leaned forward, her eyes searching mine. Why now, Victoria? You've had those files for years. You could have dismantled them when Alistair took over the firm. Why wait for the wedding? I looked at the photo of Marcel on the mantel because Alistair needed to feel what it's like to lose something he actually valued. He didn't value the firm. He valued the illusion of the firm. He didn't value his daughter. He valued the status her marriage would bring. By waiting until the wedding, I didn't just take his money. I took his audience. Beatrice nodded slowly. She wasn't horrified. She was impressed. You've turned their own weapon against them. You've made them low-level in the only world they understand. The view is different from down here, Beatrice, I said. You see things more clearly when you aren't looking down your nose at everyone. She left shortly after, leaving behind a small envelope. Inside was a key to a safe deposit box in Alistair's name, one he had hidden even from Genevieve. Beatrice had found the paperwork years ago and kept it as insurance. Use it, she had whispered. He doesn't deserve a soft landing. I held the key in my palm. It felt cold. It felt like the final nail. Alistair thought he had a secret reserve, a get-out-of-jail fund hidden away in a small-town bank. He didn't realize that in my world, there are no secrets. There are only things that haven't been filed yet. I went to my desk and opened my laptop. I didn't call the bank. I called the federal investigator who was handling the Linden Holdings case. Special Agent Miller, I said when he answered, I have some information regarding a secondary asset recovery. I believe you'll find it quite relevant to the restitution for the Lowland victims. As I spoke, I felt a weight lifting. This wasn't just about an insult at a garden party. This was about the decades of low-level people whose lives had been poisoned by the Brandons' greed. The farmers whose wells went sour. The laborers whose lungs failed. The mothers who couldn't afford the medicine because the Brandons needed a third vacation home. The wedding was dead. The name was ruined. But the justice was just beginning to breathe. The next morning brought a stillness that felt like a held breath. The local newspapers had moved the Brandon story from the society pages to the legal briefs. There were no photos of white lace or tiered cakes. Instead, there was a grainy shot of Alistair shielding his face with a briefcase as he left a preliminary hearing. He looked tired. He looked old. He looked like a man who had finally realized that the world doesn't stop turning just because your credit has been frozen. I spent the morning doing what I always do on Sundays. I polished the silver. It's a rhythmic, meditative task. You take something tarnished and dull, and with enough pressure and the right chemistry, you find the shine beneath. Marcel was in the living room, surrounded by legal pads. He hadn't gone back to his apartment yet. He was doing his own research, tracing the legislative history of the lowland protections. He wasn't looking for a way to save the Brandons. He was looking for a way to represent the victims. "Ma," he said, walking into the kitchen with a cup of cold coffee. "The scale of this, it's not just Alistair. It's the board. They all signed off on the Linden transfers. They all knew the consulting fees were actually hush money for the local EPA inspectors. I didn't stop my polishing. When you're at the top of a mountain, Marcel, the clouds tend to obscure the view of the valley. They thought they were untouchable because they were the ones writing the checks. They forgot that the people who process the checks are the ones who keep the carbon copies. The U.S. Attorney's Office is calling," he continued, his voice heavy with the gravity of his profession. "They want to know if I can provide a statement about the investment briefing Alistair tried to give us on Thursday night. They're looking at racketeering charges." I set down the silver cream. "And what will you tell them, son?" "The truth," he said. "Every word of it." He looked at me, then a long, searching gaze. "You knew they'd try to use me, didn't you? You knew from the moment I introduced Elena to you. I knew the Brandon name, Marcel. I knew the ledgers. And I knew that a man like Alistair doesn't give anything away for free, not even his daughter's hand. He saw you as a shield. I saw you as the one who would eventually have to hold the sword." The doorbell rang at noon. It wasn't a process server or a creditor. It was a delivery man with a massive, ornate floral arrangement, the kind meant for a wedding reception that didn't happen. The card was addressed to the Randall family. I opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note from Genevieve. It wasn't an apology. It was a plea. "Victoria, please. We are family now, or nearly so. Think of the children. Think of what this will do to Elena's future. We can settle this quietly. We have resources you aren't aware of. Just tell the investigators the documents were misfiled." I looked at the white roses, their petals already starting to brown at the edges. Misfiled. It's the ultimate insult to an archivist. It suggests that my life's work was a series of accidents rather than a record of reality. I turned to the delivery man. "Take these back. Tell the sender that in this house, we don't accept gifts from people we don't shake hands with." He looked confused, but he took the flowers. I watched him pull away, the vanity of the Brandons literally wilting in the back of his van. "Resources I'm not aware of," I whispered to the empty hallway. Alistair still didn't understand. He thought I was holding a grudge. He didn't realize I was holding a mirror. The resources he was referring to, the offshore accounts, the hidden safe deposit box Beatrice had told me about, were already being cataloged by the federal authorities. I hadn't just tripped him. I had removed the safety net. I went back to the kitchen and finished the silver. Each fork, each spoon was placed back in its velvet-lined drawer. Everything in its place. Everything accounted for. If you're wondering if I feel a twinge of guilt for the girl, for Elena, I think of the children in the lowlands who grew up with lead in their blood because her father wanted a faster boat. I think of the families who lost their land because the Brandons needed to stabilize their vanity. The invoice for a lifetime of arrogance is never cheap, and the Brandons are about to find out that they are completely, utterly bankrupt, not just in their bank accounts, but in the eyes of the city they thought they ruled. Monday morning was crisp, the kind of day that feels like a fresh page. I spent it in the sunroom, watching the mail carrier walk up the path. There were no more floral arrangements, no more frantic couriers, and no more velvet-lined invitations. Just the utility bills and a thick, official envelope from the Department of Justice. I didn't open it immediately. I knew what it contained. The formal acknowledgement of the evidence I had provided. The low-level clerk had finally finished her longest audit. Marcel came downstairs dressed in his best suit, not for a wedding, but for a deposition. He looked different today. The boyish softness in his jaw had tightened into something more resilient. He stood by the window, watching the same street I had watched for 40 years. "I saw Elena this morning," he said, his voice devoid of the tremor it had carried all weekend. "She was at the courthouse with her father's legal team. She tried to speak to me. I set my tea down, and I told her that the discovery process has begun," Marcel replied. "I told her that if she wanted to save herself, she should start by telling the truth about the Linden dividends she'd been receiving in her personal trust since she turned 21. She looked at me like I was a stranger, Ma, like she didn't realize I knew how to read a financial statement. I smiled. She forgot who raised you, Marcel. She thought you were an accessory to her life. She didn't realize you were the officer of the court she was about to stand before. The Brandon strategy was crumbling. They had tried to play the misunderstanding card, but the documents I provided, the original unscrubbed ledgers, were too precise. You can't argue with a decimal point. You can't charm a chronological paper trail. By noon, the news broke that Alastair had stepped down as managing partner of the firm his father built. It wasn't a retirement. It was an expulsion. The board, sensing the federal wind blowing their way, had cut him loose like a heavy anchor. I received a phone call shortly after the news went live. It was Genevieve. Her voice wasn't shrill this time. It was hollow, echoing with the sound of a woman who had finally realized the walls of her fortress were made of paper. "Victoria," she whispered, "we're leaving the St. Regis. The management asked us to vacate the suite. They said our presence was disruptive to the other guests." I leaned back in my chair, looking at the dust motes dancing in the sunlight. Disruptive. That's a polite word for it. Genevieve. I believe the word you're looking for is unmarketable. "Where are we supposed to go?" she asked, a genuine note of panic rising in her throat. "Everything is frozen. The cars, the accounts, even the estate in the Highlands is under a lien. There's a small motel on the edge of the lowlands," I said, my voice as cool as a cellar. "The water isn't great, something about the runoff, but the rates are low. I'm sure they have a room for people of your current level." The silence on the other end of the line was the most satisfying sound I've heard in 72 years. It wasn't the silence of respect. It was the silence of a total, crushing defeat. She hung up without a word. I went back to my garden. The hydrangeas were in full bloom, heavy blue heads nodding in the breeze. I thought about the garden party where this all began. I thought about the hand Alastair wouldn't shake. He thought he was protecting his circle from a low-level woman. He didn't realize that by refusing to touch my hand, he had lost the only person who could have shown him how to fix the cracks in his own. He chose distance over decency, and now distance is all he has left. If you think this is a sad ending, you haven't been paying attention to the victims in the valley. The air there is finally starting to clear. The people who were poisoned by the Brandon greed are finally seeing the lawyers they deserve. The wedding day arrived, not with the planned fanfare, but with a cooling breeze that swept through the empty pews of the Episcopal Cathedral. The lilies had been sent to a local hospice. The champagne had been returned to the distributor. The city, which once looked at the Brandon name as a pillar of society, was now looking at it as a cautionary tale in the morning papers. I sat on my front porch in my favorite rocking chair, a glass of iced tea sweating in my hand. Beside me, Marcel sat with a thick stack of depositions. He wasn't the groom today. He was something far more permanent, the lead counsel for the Lowlands Restitution Project. The first settlement checks should go out by next month, Ma, he said, his voice quiet and filled with a deep, earned satisfaction. The Brandon Trust was liquidated this morning. Even the house in the Highlands is on the auction block. The EPA estimate for the cleanup is staggering, but Alistair's hidden Delaware accounts covered the first phase. I watched a blue jay land on the birdbath. A house built on sand always returns to the beach. Marcel, it's just a matter of the tide. We sat in a comfortable silence for a long time. It's the kind of silence you can only have when the truth has finally finished its work. A silver sedan pulled up to the curb. It wasn't a luxury car. It was a mid-range rental, the kind you get when your credit cards are being monitored by a federal monitor. Elena stepped out. She didn't walk toward the porch. She stood by the mailbox, her shadow long on the pavement. She looked at Marcel, then at me. There was no anger left in her eyes. There was only a profound, hollow exhaustion. She held up a small, white envelope. She didn't speak. She just tucked it into the flag of the mailbox and walked back to the car. When the car had disappeared, Marcel went down to retrieve it. He opened the envelope and pulled out a single handwritten note. He read it, his face unreadable, then handed it to me. You were right, Victoria. The view from the ground is much clearer. My father is signing the plea deal this afternoon. I'm moving to my aunt's farm in North Carolina. I think I need to learn how to work with my hands. I folded the note and tucked it into my pocket. It wasn't a victory letter. It was a receipt. Alistair Brandon had spent his life avoiding the low-level people of the world. He had refused my hand because he feared the stain of my history, my work, and my skin. He didn't realize that the dirt he was so afraid of was the very thing that made the world grow. Now, he was sitting in a gray cell, surrounded by the very people he had spent decades looking down upon. He was finally, truly on their level. I looked down at my own hands. They were wrinkled, spotted with age, and etched with the lines of 72 years of living. They had filed millions of papers, raised a good man, and quietly dismantled a dynasty. Are you okay, Ma? Marcel asked, placing his hand over mine. I turned my hand over and gripped his, my fingers strong and sure. I'm more than okay, son. I'm finished. The Brandons thought they were the authors of this story. They thought they controlled the narrative because they held the gold. But they forgot that the story is always written by the one who keeps the records. And in the end, the only thing that lasts isn't the wealth or the name. It's the integrity of the ledger. I took a slow sip of my tea. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, orange glow over my neighborhood. It's a quiet life, a low-level life, but the air is clean, the ground is solid, and for the first time in 30 years, the books are perfectly balanced. Thank you for watching this story on Vintage Vengeance. If you've ever been underestimated because of where you come from or the work you do, remember, the quietest person in the room is often the one holding the keys. Don't forget to like and subscribe to hear more stories of those who waited for the perfect time to settle the score. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And tell me, where in the world are you watching from? I'd love to know how far the truth has traveled today.